It was a cold and melancholy afternoon on January 25, 1967, when the icy winter winds blew through Ashland, a small village in Massachusetts. The snow piled up on the streets and rooftops transformed the landscape into an almost fantastical scene. But inside the Andreasson family's house, the atmosphere was far from serene. Betty Andreasson, a 40-year-old woman, was busy in the kitchen preparing dinner for her 7 children. The aroma of the food mixed with the heat emanating from the stove, creating a cozy feeling, a stark contrast to the cold outside. In the living room, her elderly and tired parents tried to calm the children while watching the local news on a black and white TV. Betty took care of everyone by herself as her husband, James, was hospitalized after a serious car accident. He had been badly injured, and the future was uncertain. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 6:25 p.m. when something unusual began to happen. The lights in the house started to flicker, initially subtly, as if responding to a power outage. But then, suddenly, all the lights went out at the same time, plunging the house into complete darkness. The TV hissed, and the image disappeared, turning the room into a sea of static. The children, who had been calm before, started to cry and scream, frightened by the sudden lack of light. But before Betty could react, an intense, pulsating orange-red light began to shine from outside, cutting through the windows and flooding the kitchen with a strange, almost supernatural glow. Feeling a chill run down her spine, Betty ran into the living room to protect her children. Her father, an elderly man with still sharp eyes, got up and went to the kitchen window to see what was happening. What he saw made his heart race. There was a hill near the house, a place he knew well, but that night was different. A powerful light emanated from behind the hill, illuminating the night sky in a surreal way. But that wasn't all. Moving toward the house, he saw strange, bizarre figures. They moved in an unusual way, almost as if they were floating or jumping through the air. They were small, perhaps the size of children, but their shapes were grotesque, distorted, like something out of a nightmare. At first, the old man thought they were children wearing Halloween costumes out of season, maybe a tasteless prank. However, as the creatures approached, he realized he was facing something much more sinister. When one of the creatures lifted its head and stared directly at him, he felt a primordial terror, something he had never felt in his entire life. His legs weakened and he took a step back, feeling the weight of fear descend upon him. The creatures, noticing they were being observed, immediately stopped moving. They remained as still as statues, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, 4 of them began to approach the house, moving with an almost supernatural fluidity. To everyone's horror, the creatures passed through the kitchen door as if it simply didn't exist, as if matter was no obstacle for them. Betty, now in the living room, froze as she saw the beings entering the house. They were even more terrifying up close. They had grayish, almost translucent skin with a texture that resembled melted wax. Their heads were disproportionately large, pear-shaped, and their eyes, large and feline, shone with an inhuman intensity. Their faces had no distinct features except for small holes where their noses and ears should have been. Their mouths were just thin lines without movement, as if permanently sealed. The creatures wore dark blue, body-hugging uniforms that reflected the orange-red light still pulsing from outside. On the left arm of each one there was an emblem, a bird with open wings, which would later be revealed as a symbol of great importance. Betty's memory seemed to flash in and out at that moment. Fear overtook her, and she couldn't focus on what was happening. All she remembered afterward was waking up the next morning in bed, as if nothing had happened. The house was silent. The routine seemed to have returned to normal, but inside her, there was a void, a gap in time that left her uneasy. She didn't know how she had ended up in bed, nor how her children and parents had returned to their rooms. Being a deeply religious woman, Betty initially associated that experience with something celestial. Perhaps angels had visited her home, she thought. But there was something at the back of her mind that disturbed her, a sense that those beings were not of divine origin. For reasons she couldn't explain, Betty decided not to tell anyone about what had happened, not even the family members who were present. She instructed them to forget that night, to never mention what they had seen. After all, in 1967, talking about extraterrestrial beings or UFOs was risky, especially in a small religious community like theirs. The years passed, and Betty managed to bury that memory deep in her mind. She continued with her life, raising her children and caring for her parents. But something inside her had changed. There was a restlessness she couldn't shake, a feeling that the event, as disturbing as it was just the beginning. In 1975, 8 years after the incident, one of Betty's now adult daughters came across an article in a local newspaper that caught her attention. The article, written by Dr. Alan Hynek, a respected astronomer and consultant to the U.S. Air Force, discussed UFO sightings and alien abductions. Hynek, who had been the chief investigator of Project Blue Book, a government study on unidentified aerial phenomena, was asking anyone who had experienced similar events to contact him. Convincing Betty to talk about what happened that night wasn't easy. She feared being ridiculed, feared that people would see her as crazy or delusional. However, her daughter was persistent, arguing that it was important to share the experience, that maybe others had gone through something similar, and that they weren't alone. Finally, in January 1977, Betty decided to tell her story. She wrote a long letter to the Center for UFO Studies, describing everything she could remember about that night. The letter immediately caught the attention of investigators. They knew Betty's account wasn't a simple invention. There were details in what she described that matched other abduction cases being investigated at the time. A team of specialists was sent to Ashland to investigate the Andreasson family's case. The investigators arrived on a cold winter morning, the gray sky reflecting the gravity of what they were about to discover. The Andreasson house, a modest wooden structure, seemed like an ordinary place, but they soon realized they were dealing with something extraordinary. The seriousness with which Betty and her family treated the matter was evident. They weren't seeking fame or fortune, but answers to something that had left a deep mark on their lives. Betty and her daughter, who was 21 at the time of the investigation, agreed to undergo a series of regressive hypnosis sessions conducted by experienced professionals. Hypnosis was a technique used to access repressed memories, especially in cases of trauma. And what emerged from these sessions was a story that defied understanding. During the sessions, Betty began to recall details that had been blocked from her conscious mind. She remembered how, after the creatures entered the house, they immediately placed her entire family in a state of suspended animation, a deep trance that left them inert. Betty, however, was chosen to be taken aboard a ship that was parked behind the hill near her house. The feeling of being telepathically controlled was indescribable. Betty felt as if her will had been completely dominated by the beings. She was led outside the house, where she saw an egg-shaped craft silently hovering above the ground. The craft seemed to emit its own light, a soft glow that contrasted with the darkness of the night. Unable to resist, Betty was taken inside the craft, which then took off, heading into the night sky. Inside the craft, Betty was led to a circular room, where the beings began to perform a series of medical procedures on her. The room was lit by a diffuse light that seemed to emanate from the walls, creating an unreal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. Betty found herself lying on a table, unable to move, while the beings moved around her with clinical, inhuman efficiency. They inserted a long, flexible needle into her nose, a painful and invasive sensation that made her shudder. The needle was used to extract a small object the size of a lead pellet that was lodged in her nasal cavity. Betty described the object as something metallic, with small, thin wires protruding from it, a technology she couldn't comprehend. After the procedure, Betty was taken to another room, connected by a dark tunnel that seemed endless. The feeling of claustrophobia overwhelmed her, but she couldn't fight against the control the beings exerted over her. When they finally reached their destination, Betty found herself in an even stranger place. It was a large room with walls that seemed to be made of a translucent material, almost like glass, but with a texture that resembled ice. In the center of the room, a hologram floated, depicting the image of a mythological bird, the phoenix, rising from the ashes. Betty immediately recognized the bird as the same one on the emblem of the creature's uniforms. The beings began to communicate telepathically with Betty, explaining that she had been chosen to witness things of great importance to humanity. They said the phoenix symbolized the cycle of death and rebirth, and that she should carry this message to the world. Betty, still in a state of shock, was taken on a tour of the interior of the craft, where she saw technologies and scenarios that defied her understanding. She saw what appeared to be entire cities encapsulated in energy bubbles, floating gardens, and machines that operated without human intervention. Afterward, Betty was taken back to her house. She didn't remember how she had returned, only that she was back in her bed the next morning. The experience had left a deep mark on her mind, but the gaps in her memory prevented her from fully understanding what had happened. Upon waking, she felt confused and disoriented, but she tried to continue her life as usual. The investigators, intrigued by the description of the implant removed from Betty's nose, decided to delve deeper into the investigation. They knew this type of artifact was mentioned in other abduction cases and began to wonder if Betty had been monitored by these beings throughout her life. New hypnosis sessions revealed that Betty's abductions had begun long before the 1967 incident. In fact, she had been abducted multiple times since childhood. One of the most disturbing memories that emerged during the hypnosis sessions was of an incident that occurred when Betty was only 5 years old. She remembered being taken from her bed during the night by a bright light that passed through the walls of her house. The next thing she knew, she was in a white, cold room, surrounded by the same beings who abducted her years later. Betty described how she was placed in a machine that seemed to scan her entire body, and how she felt a penetrating cold as the machine passed over her. Another memory recovered was from when Betty was 13 years old. She remembered waking up early one summer morning and deciding to walk to a nearby lake in Westminster. While walking around the lake, she spotted a round object floating over the water, which quickly descended toward her. Betty tried to run, but before she could escape, she was paralyzed by an invisible force and transported inside the object. Inside the object, Betty was taken to an underground complex where she saw something that deeply disturbed her: a human zoo. Human beings from different eras and cultures were trapped in glass or ice cubes, displayed like specimens in a museum. There were men, women, and children, all in a state of trance, seemingly alive but frozen in time. Betty remembered feeling deep sadness and terror seeing those people trapped there like animals in a cage. The medical procedures continued throughout her abductions. On one occasion, when Betty was 26, she was taken against her will to a ship and placed in a room where there was a pregnant woman tied to a bed. The creatures asked Betty to help calm the woman, and then they performed a bizarre procedure, removing the baby from the woman's womb and inserting needles into the newborn's head. They explained to Betty that they were creating hybrids between humans and their own species, and that the baby needed to be kept in an artificial womb to continue its development. Years passed, and the Andreasson case became one of the most documented and studied cases in the history of ufology. Over more than 15 years, dozens of hypnosis sessions were conducted, revealing a series of abductions and traumatic experiences that Betty had endured. The investigators compiled more than 528 pages of detailed reports, divided into 3 volumes. The case was published in a book titled The Andreasson Affair, released in 1978, and it became a landmark in ufological literature. Even after the book's publication, the investigators continued to keep in touch with Betty and her family. They conducted new hypnosis sessions, which revealed even more details about the abductions. It was discovered that Betty had been abducted since she was 5 years old, and that the beings had monitored and manipulated her life in ways she could never have imagined. Betty lived the rest of her life under the shadow of these experiences, marked by a mixture of fear and fascination with the unknown. She passed away at 85 on March 18, 2022, while sleeping at one of her daughter's homes. Even after her death, the Andreasson case continued to be widely discussed and studied, remaining one of the most believed and intriguing cases in the field of ufology. It is likely that some details of the Andreasson case were not covered in this video, as there are many details and the content would have become excessively long. However, feel free to leave in the comments what you already knew about the case and your opinion on this remarkable abduction story. Hallucination or reality? Currently, the Andreasson case is considered one of the most convincing examples of alien abduction, serving as a disturbing testimony to what might be happening beyond human understanding. Betty Andreasson's story reminds us that the universe is vast and mysterious, and there is much more out there than we can imagine. There are many other reports of abductions, contacts, UFO or UAP sightings, as you may prefer to call them, in various parts of the world, which share disturbing similarities with the Andreasson case. So if you enjoy this topic, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give this video a like. That way YouTube recommends our content to more UFO enthusiasts. See you next time.